guess our story starts in September of 2014 when we first fell pregnant with our first little one. And a bit of a difficult pregnancy. I was quite ill throughout with hyperemesis, and it wasn't the most fun. But due to the hyperemesis and her position, we weren't having the best amount of movement as we got closer and closer to the point that we should have been getting quite a lot of movement. And after discussing it with a bank midwife at the time, who had sort of reassured us that it was due to baby's position and that she was, we didn't know she was a she at that point, but that baby was oblique across my tummy, so that a lot of the movement that I was feeling, she assumed was baby stretching, because the amount of kicks I was feeling had sort of decreased a little bit. And we'd sort of been a bit reassured that no, it was just baby stretching out the way rather than up and down and not having as much room to move. And we went home and we were okay. And I just slowly, progressively started to get less and less happy about that, and thought, no, but it was my first baby. I didn't know what I was meant to be feeling, obviously. And she'd actually, our other midwife had come in during that appointment, but she'd been a bit rushed, so that was why we had a bank midwife. And she'd seen how worried I was and upset, so she'd referred us for a growth scan. But because I was only measuring fractionally small, I wasn't out with the norm, the growth scan had been knocked back, and they hadn't agreed to do it. So it was the next week that I thought, no, I'm really not happy about this. There's definitely less movement. I'm not really feeling much apart from these stretches, but I couldn't tell the difference between Braxton Hicks and if baby was moving. And we eventually, one night, I knew that there was something really, really wrong. I don't know how I knew, because it wasn't a huge difference in what I was feeling. I just knew. And I'd spoken to my partner that night and I said, no, I'm not happy about this. And he'd sat and felt my tummy and said, but I can feel movement. There's definitely sort of rolling going on there. And I said, no, I can't feel it. I can just feel stretching. And I'd actually had the stretching feeling during the appointment with the midwife, and she'd felt my tummy and said, oh no, that's baby moving. And then when we went in, it turned out it wasn't baby moving at all. It was Braxton Hicks. And I'd been counting it as movement for about a week. And so we went into the Royal, into triage, and had a little bit of a wait, not a huge wait. They were fabulous with us, they were. And went into the room. The midwife tried to find the heartbeat, couldn't find it. I knew at that point, definitely knew. My partner didn't, and he was sort of waiting for the scan and was still in that, no, they'll be fine, we just need to get a scan, just being awkward. But I knew, and I remember looking at the midwife and almost, it wasn't a smile in a smile way, but it was this, I know what's coming smile. Of I know what's about to happen. So we got taken into the scan room, and then those words that never ever leave you. The consultant came in and scanned and just turned to us and said, I'm really sorry, but your baby has died. Sorry. And after that, most of it's a blur. I don't really remember much about what then happened. I remember them telling me that I'd have to give birth. And me thinking that was the most barbaric thing on the planet, and how could they make me do this? And the idea that I would have to see my dead baby was horrific. And the thought that that would be almost burned into my eyelids for the rest of my life. I thought, I can't do this. I actually cannot do this. They can't expect me to. And then I'll always remember phoning my mum. And it's just the sort of most heartbreaking moment almost, as I could hear her on the phone. And he phoned her and he didn't know what to say, and he just said that the baby's died. And I could just hear her, what? Over the phone. And it's still like, that's one of those bits that just replays in my head sometimes. Then I was terrified about her driving to the hospital. And so both our parents came to the hospital, both our mums came to the hospital. And I remember feeling so much guilt. Like, all I said after they told us that was sorry. That was all I felt like I said. I just repeatedly said sorry to Colin, to the midwives for breaking down, to everybody. But I just felt so horrifically guilty for, at that point, I felt like I'd let everybody down. I'd let my baby down. I'd let my partner down. I'd let his family down. I'd let my family down, who were all expecting this wonderful gift. And I'd taken it away from them. And I just remember repeatedly saying to Colin, I am so sorry. I am so sorry. I am so, so sorry. And the midwife sort of stopped me and said, this isn't your fault. This is nothing you have done that has made this happen. And I said, but he would have been the most amazing daddy. And I remember her saying it, and I didn't get it at the time. I didn't. And she said, he still will be. And to me, I thought she was almost talking about in the future, that in the future you will have another baby and he will be that baby's daddy and he will be perfect. Because at that time I was still almost quite detached. I'd had a horrible pregnancy. I'd never been like, oh, my bump, because it had been so horrific. And yeah, I was still quite detached from the fact that it was a baby. In my head at that time, it was a pregnancy. And I think that's one of the reasons that it's so difficult to get through to people who don't understand it, because you don't until it happens, literally until it happens to you. And I was still in this, no, I don't want to see the baby, I don't want to hold the baby, I don't want any of this. I cannot do this. And our mums came. I couldn't even face Colin's mum. She got there first, and I could not have her in the room. I couldn't face seeing her because I couldn't face someone else's grief at that point. And the midwife was great. She's like, Colin's mum arrived while we were still in the scan room, and we'd been talking to the consultant. I have no idea what the consultant said. Totally humphed at that. It just a blur at that point. But I remember Colin's mum must have been in the waiting room, and the midwife taking me from the scan room back to like one of the consulting rooms, and me like almost hiding as we walked past the double doors, because I couldn't handle seeing anybody else, and seeing their disappointment, and so she sort of whisked me past, and she was like, you do not have to see anybody, you do not want to see, this is about you and Colin right now. And she was incredibly supportive. She was a really, really lovely lady. And I felt sort of cocooned by her at that point. It was like in this little bubble of, right, you're protecting me right now. And Colin and I just clung together basically at that point. And then we left, and because both of our mums were there and both of them were driving, we didn't want either of them to drive alone. So when we left, Colin went with his mum and I went with mine, because we were just round the corner from the hospital, really. And I remember getting into the car, and I don't think I've ever made a sound like it. I just remember getting into the car with my mum and punching the dashboard and letting out this absolutely primal scream. And it just all came out because I'd cried and I'd apologised constantly, but I'd held sort of everything in, and then I was just with my mum and I was safe, and it just absolutely poured out of me. So I'd had the tablet when I was in the hospital. They'd given me the tablet to start things going, and then we were to go away for 2 days and go home. And those 2 days, and I know it's different for everybody, but for me and for us, those 2 days were the absolute worst, the absolute lowest. And for us, they were almost worse than having to walk out the hospital without Isla, because at that point, there was no love, there was no light that we could take away from those 2 days. They were just horrific. And we went home, and because of the hyperemesis doesn't mix well with stress, and it doesn't mix well with hormones. Yeah, sorry. No, it's fine. So hyperemesis doesn't mix well with stress or hormones. And when we got home, about half an hour after, 45 minutes after I'd had the tablet, I started being sick, and I didn't stop being sick. And it was about every 10 minutes, 15 minutes, as soon as my stomach would fill back up with bile, I would be sick again. I tore my esophagus, was vomiting blood everywhere, and then acid over the tear. It was horrific, and it was so painful. And that just went on just throughout that day and the night. And I'd phoned back to the hospital, but they'd sort of said, oh no, being sick's quite normal. Not this much. And I remember that night, like, Colin and my mum took turns getting some sleep, while the other one would sit up with me and just sort of rub my back while I was vomiting and crying constantly. And the next morning, Colin phoned our GP, and they prescribed omeprazole and diazepam, and I don't know which one worked, but one of them did. And the sickness stopped, and I was able to get some sleep. And then once I got up in the afternoon, that was when it all really sort of, you get that horrible moment of you wake up and think, oh crap, this has all happened. And I'm a bit of an information junkie, so I'd gone away, and I mean, we'd left the hospital, we didn't get anything, we didn't get a leaflet, nothing, when we left the hospital that day. And you're sort of just cast adrift a bit in those 2 days, and you've been given all this information verbally by the consultants and things about what's physically about to happen to you, nothing about what's emotionally about to happen, but all about what's physically going to happen. But even then, you don't really take it in after you've heard those words. You know, once you know that your baby has died and they're still inside you and you have to go home, like, that just doesn't go in. So I'm a bit of a, right, if I know what's happening, then I can cope a bit better. So I went away and I read on the internet. I went and searched and found anything that was remotely relevant. And I read and I read and I read. And I read stories of parents who had not spent time with their babies, parents who had spent time with their babies. And I began to realise that I had to. That I absolutely had to spend some time. I had to have photos, even if I didn't want to. At that point, I didn't want to do any of this. But I knew I had to, or else I would regret it. And it was only through reading and hearing it from the horse's mouth, so to speak, and hearing other people's stories that I came to that conclusion. And so I always remember reading one lady's story, and she'd felt very much like me, that she didn't want anything. And I think because of that, it really resonated with me. And then she just said, but then she was born. And of course I gave birth to her. She was my daughter. And it sort of clicked a little bit in my head. I even went away, I found a website that people very bravely have uploaded the photos of their baby at different gestations. and you have to go through quite a little rigmarole to get to be able to look at the photos, quite rightly so. And I remember sitting, like, willing myself to have the courage to click the last button to look at the baby at 28 weeks gestation. And so I knew what I might have to expect. And I remember reading things about, depending on baby's condition, you might not want to see them, you might want to see them. And that was really stuck in my head of, I might not want to see her depending on when she died and depending what's happened. And then, but I knew I had to after reading everything. I knew. So we went back in, and the next day in the afternoon, and there was a bereavement midwife there waiting for us, and she was absolutely lovely, but I think she'd been on since the morning, and they'd sort of said to us, just come in whenever you're ready on the day, absolutely whenever. And again, I hadn't slept the night before, so both my mum and Colin, were very much of the view, no, you need to sleep. You're about to give birth. You need sleep. So I'd gone to sleep for a little bit in the morning, and we got there about 2:00 in the afternoon. By the time I was actually ready to will myself to leave the house, because it was this horrible thing of you're sitting there, and I remember the night before, just at very low fluid, so we could feel her. We could feel every part of her, basically, in my tummy. And then I was getting these Braxton Hicks, so that was making it even more obvious, and you could see her outline, and it was horrible. And it was this horrible thing of knowing that your baby is gone, but still inside you, and you just, at that, my head was going in between just wanting it done and having her out, and then being absolutely terrified of going in and doing this. So I eventually willed myself to leave the house, and we got there, and we got taken up to the labour ward and went into the room right at the back, and right in the corner, and I just remember just not wanting to be there at all in any way, shape or form. And the bereavement midwife was great. She was really, really lovely, and she went through all the options with us. And as I was saying to you earlier, that we knew we needed photos and that we would want them in the future. But at that point, the idea of having the medical photographer come in and take photos of us as a family, or us taking photos on our phones, it just felt really, really wrong for us. And that was just at that point. So we decided to have photos taken after we'd left the hospital by the medical photographers of Isla on her own. At that point, still didn't know she was Isla. And we discussed everything that was going to happen. I was given the pessaries to start the labour off, and then we went and we walked quite a lot. Just kept walking around the hospital, and I don't know how he did it, but Colin managed to somehow have me laughing at points. I really don't know how. I remember going for a walk around the outside of the hospital and going back in through the front doors and getting a contraction. I can't even remember what he said, but I remember having this contraction and laughing. And I thought, how can you make me laugh while I'm having a contraction, full stop, but while we're going through this, but we really just clung together. Like, that was our way of coping with what was happening. It was just supporting each other, and we'd go through one moment, it would be one of us that was breaking down, and the other one would be there to support. And we've never been very good at that, but somehow she brought us into that. And I remember my mum saying afterwards, she was like, "No, you became an adult." She was like, "You've always come to me for support before now. You'll always go to Colin, but you've always, if you really, really, really need help, it's right, go to Mum." She was like, whereas in this, it wasn't. It was you two, and you just totally supported and clung to each other. And she was like, and that's the way it should be. And I'm so proud of you both for that. And then, I mean, things progressed quite slowly once I'd had the pessaries. At first, wasn't much happening really. And I was having a few contractions here and there, and they were starting to get a wee bit stronger, but you know, it's still in everyone's head. We were still in for the long haul, really. And it's still all quite a bit of a blur, and I remember just being quite closed off. It was just Colin and I in our little world at that point. Our mums were both there to support us, and Sandy, the chaplain at the time, he was lovely, and he came up and spoke to us about funeral arrangements and started the sort of discussion about postmortems and things like that. And then he said a little prayer with us and sort of left us to our devices, and the midwives mainly sort of pulled back and just let us get on with it, which was exactly what we needed. It might not be what other people need, but it was very much what we needed at the time. We just needed to be together and ourselves. And then later on in the evening, it sort of got to about 11 o'clock at night, and nothing was really happening. And, you know, I'd originally planned on having my mum there during the birth. I'd planned on having her there during the birth no matter what, from day one of the pregnancy, because I thought, you know, if I get anxious, she can calm me down the fastest. That's probably the most sensible thing. But it got to about 11, nothing was happening. So they said, you know, you go home, get some rest, and come back in the morning for when you'll need it. So it was just Colin and I overnight. And things just slowly picked up really quite quickly. And by about 1 o'clock, I was desperate for more medication. And I think they came in, called them, and they came in at about 1:30, I think. And she said she was going to double check, because I was due for my next pessary. So she was going to double check where we were and then get me more pain relief. And she checked me and went, oh, all I can feel is baby, it's time to push. So it had just gone so quickly, because I thought that the contractions were really starting, and I thought, oh God, I'm going to be in for hours of this. But it wasn't, it was transition. And I looked at them and I said, my mum's not going to get here in time, is she? And they were like, no, you can phone her, but no. And I just thought, I was terrified. But looking back, I'm so glad, because it was such a bonding thing for Colin and I just to do it together. And I think Isla just wanted her mummy and daddy, she didn't want anybody else there. And so got up in the bed and it all sort of started. And I was terrified. I was absolutely terrified. And then she got stuck. So it all got a bit scary for a little while. My contractions stopped, and the consultant had to come in, and so there were like 3 or 4 people at the bottom of the bed, and because she was breech, her chin had got hooked. So it was pretty uncomfortable, because I hadn't had an epidural or anything. It was just, and I stupidly, I point blank refused gas and air, because I wanted it to be as different as possible from if I was going to have another baby. Really bizarrely, in my head, I was like, no, this has to be different. If I have another baby, I want it to be a different experience. So my ideal was to have gas and air and to do as natural as possible. So I don't want the gas and air this time. It was really bizarre, but that was my weird thinking at the time. So I was refusing that and just going, no, I want it to be different. they had to give me some spray under my tongue to try and start the contractions again, and it did all get a bit scary. And then I just felt this pop, which I assume was my waters, because there was very, very, very little of them, so they didn't break until I started pushing. But at the time, like, my biggest fear, because the worst had already happened, we'd already lost our baby, so my biggest, hugest fear was, especially when I'd thought of my mum being there too, I had this vision of something happening to me, or me hemorrhaging or something, and me drifting away as the two of them are on either side of me, and they've lost their daughter. Well, my mum's lost her daughter, my partner's lost his partner and his baby, and it was the fear for them, not for me. At that point, couldn't have given two hoots about what happened to me, perfectly honestly, but for them, it was horrible. And I just remember being absolutely terrified when I heard that pop, and I thought that something had happened. And Colin just sort of grabbed my face and held me facing him and was like, "It's fine, we're together, we can do this, no matter what happens, we're doing this, come on." And it was like there was two different worlds in the delivery room. It was just, there was me and Colin, and then there was everything that was happening at the bottom. And then eventually she was born. And I remember saying to the midwife, it's really sad because I don't even know that midwife's name. I know the midwife, the main midwife that was with us. We had Jude, who was the bereavement midwife at first. And then we had Kate, and they were both fantastic. But there was another midwife who came in to assist during the labour, and she was amazing. And I don't know her name. I have no way of sort of thanking her. But I looked at her, because Kate was focused on the medical side of it, because that was what her and the doctor were doing. And I looked at the other midwife, and I just remember this panic of, do I want to see the baby? That was the first thing I said, is, do I want to see the baby? And she said, "Oh, she looks really peaceful." And I just went, "It's a little girl." And she said, "Oh, let me double check. But yes, I think it's a little girl. I didn't know you didn't know, sorry." And then we'd had my pram blanket from when I was little. And again, because I wanted it to be quite different, I said, "Yeah, could you clean the baby up a little bit?" So they took her away and cleaned her up, wrapped her in my pram blanket, which was huge for her, and brought her over. And right up until the moment she was in my arms, that fear of remembering all of this and of not being able to put this behind us was still there. And then the minute that she was in my arms and the minute I saw her, it totally flipped on its head to this fear of forgetting her or forgetting that moment, because it was the most, bizarrely, still the best moment ever. It was the worst and best day of our lives all rolled into one. And that wave of love and pride, so much pride, did not come. That still hit us like a ton of bricks the second that we saw her. And she was beautiful, and she was perfect, and she was just gorgeous. And I just remember looking at her and just in awe, like, of this little person that we'd made. And yes, I was heartbroken, absolutely devastated, that she wasn't alive, and that we didn't get that cry, and that she didn't get to open her eyes. But that love sort of almost overtook all of that in a bizarre way. The love was so much stronger, and I hadn't anticipated that at all. I hadn't. To the point that I remember my mum and Colin's mum, where they came in a few hours later. They gave us our time together, and they came in a few hours later to meet her. By that point, the sun had started to come up, and I remember my mum saying to me that she was absolutely stealing herself for walking into that room. She'd waited for Colin's mum, because my mum had got there first, and she said, and I stood outside that room just terrified of what I was about to find behind the door. She said, because you're my baby. She said, and you've just gone through the worst, the most horrific thing. She said, and I just wished I could have done it for you. Sort of, no, no, you're not getting that. That was my job. And she said she opened the door and she came in and there was light streaming through the window from the sun rising. And she looked at me and I was smiling. And she said, you were obviously heartbroken. You were crying, but you were smiling. She said you were so proud, and all I could feel in that room was love. And that was how we felt. It was just this bubble of love. And the chaplain came and blessed her. And we just spent as much time as we could. We spent about 6.5 hours with her. We didn't have a cuddle cot or anything. I don't know if they had a cuddle cot at that point or, but we just spent hours cuddling and just loving on her and giving her loads and loads and loads and loads of love. And then it got to the point where it was actually Colin really, really struggled with seeing her start to deteriorate. And he couldn't really cope with it anymore. And I knew that I was going to have to press that buzzer and ask them to come and take her away. But I knew I also had to do that for him. And as much as I probably could have handled a lot more time, she was his baby too, and he needed that. So I always remember, and it's my most treasured memory actually of her and of that time. And it was so spontaneous. I hadn't planned on it. We hadn't planned on sort of bathing her or anything like that. We just cuddled for hours. But I remember, because I knew that I was going to have to press the buzzer soon, I just need to feel her against my chest one more time. I just need to feel her. And I lifted her up, but because she'd been lying on her back for a little bit and because she deteriorated slightly, a little bit of blood just dripped from her nose and dripped onto her tummy. And it was just a totally natural motherly instinct to then clean her up. And there's a face cloth and a little basin beside the bed from when Colin had been mopping my brow. And I just reflexively reached for it and I mopped up the little bits of blood, and then it just continued. It was just totally natural that I just continued, and I washed her all over, head to toe. And it was just this really precious moment where I totally just zoned in on the two of us, and it was the one moment that I closed Colin out and that I closed everything out, and it was just us. And it really was such a special moment, and I'll always remember that moment. So much so that when my subsequent baby Joshua was born, I didn't want to do that because I didn't want to take away from that. I got Daddy to do the first bath because I didn't want to take away from that. That was the one thing I had with his big sister that was just us. And I needed that to almost stay totally pure and just. It was weird. And then I pressed the buzzer and the two of us just clung to each other after that, and it was really difficult because we were waiting to be cleared to go home, and it was hours, and we just wanted to, once we'd handed her over to a stranger, and knew that she was in the next room, knew that she was just near us but not with us, we just needed to get out of that hospital. But there'd been, and I totally understand that, there'd been emergency after emergency that day, and it was hours before a consultant could come and clear us and do all the paperwork that needed to be done. They came and discussed post-mortem with us. That was the midwife who had been there at the birth. came to say goodbye before her shift ended. And we were still really up in the air about postmortem. Well, I wasn't. I knew I didn't want one. Colin had been quite up in the air about it until he met her, until he had her in his arms. And then he was like, no, I can't do that to her. And they came to discuss it with us. And it totally different for everybody. And I totally get that. And at that point, I wasn't thinking about the baby loss community that I'd been thrust into. And I wasn't thinking about other parents in the future who maybe a postmortem on Isla would have given more information to prevent things in the future. I was purely thinking as her mummy. And at that point, for us, and as it really is different for everybody, and I know that, but for us at that point, we'd gone into sort of parent mode. And when you're a parent, you do things for your child, not yourself. And all we could think was that if we got a postmortem, that would be for us. That would be to give us answers. That wouldn't be for her. And that was all we could think. And when that other midwife came and spoke to us, she explained that we can pick and choose what we wanted to happen. She was fantastic. She made us feel so much better about everything. Because everything else had been quite regimented and you go through the form and this is what happens. Whereas she sat and discussed with us that, no, you could say that you don't want a full physical postmortem, but you can still have the karyotype testing. You can say, yes, I want this. No, I don't want that. And so this is entirely up to you. And I'd looked into, again, Information Junkie beforehand. I'd read everything up as much as I could. But she also she told us more about the actual birth because she'd been there. And she explained that the placenta had come with Isla rather than after, which suggests it had sheared off. And she said that it wasn't a very healthy looking placenta. So we, with her size and with her being absolutely, we pretty much knew that it was an issue with the placenta anyway. So at that point, we were just like, no, we can't do this. I would karyotype testing, fine. Check that there wasn't something genetic going on. But for us at the moment, we can't do this to her because it's for us, not her. And I haven't ever regretted that. I really haven't. We got the answers back. They tested the placenta and it wasn't fab. It was not a good placenta. It started to fail and then there was a big clot, which explains exactly everything that happened with her. And she was tiny. She was in the sort of first percentile for her gestation. But she was absolutely perfect. So they eventually came and discussed all that with us. And that was one bit that wasn't very helpful. And I mean, the Royal were fantastic with us in general. And I do understand that they have to make sure that this is an informed choice. I totally get that. But for us, it just went on too long, the discussions about the postmortem, when we'd made very, very clear what we wanted. And it just kept coming back and kept getting pushed. And to the point that my mum eventually semi-snapped at one of the midwives and said, no, look, this is an informed choice. And I understand that you have to make sure that that's the case. But Steph has read up on everything. She has listened to everything you've said. But they both still feel this way. You know, you have to respect that. And then they did sort of back off a bit. And yeah, then once all that was done, we eventually got to go home. And that was horrific, walking out the hospital with your memory box when you should be walking out the hospital with your baby, especially when, because she was a certain gestation, which I don't like the fact that that happens anyway, we had the bigger memory box. And it was about the size of her. And it was a box that was the size of my baby. And it's a white box that's slightly almost, it's bigger, deeper, but it was almost coffin-like. And this, walking out with this box was pretty horrific. But those 2 days beforehand were still worse, and it's bizarre. It's really bizarre, but we were still on a high from having her. We were still so proud and still had all this love. And I remember still feeling that when I then phoned you, Nicola, and contacted Sans Lothians about funeral arrangements and stuff, and we were still in this cocoon of sort of love where we hadn't sort of gone back out into the big bad world yet. And we'd had midwives that understood what was going on and were fantastic. Our community midwives were amazing. And even down to going to register her stillbirth, the woman who registered it was so lovely, and she never once called it a certificate of stillbirth. Not once. She called it Isla's birth certificate. And she asked us if we had any other children. She, her language in general was all very much validating that Isla was a little person. She wasn't a pregnancy loss. She was a baby who had existed and who had been born, and yes, sadly, she'd been stillborn, but she was real. And I think that's, people really really struggle with that. And I can't judge it, because I probably would have been the same myself before it happened to me. And I didn't want to see her. I didn't want any of that. And it was, no, just take the baby away. And that was how I felt at first, until she was in my arms and it all flipped on its head. And there were quite a few moments that things like that happened, where things flipped on its head with that. And then after contacting Sans Lothians and discussing funeral arrangements, and you phoned us back, Nicola, like in your own time, I may add, and were on the phone to us for about 2 hours just talking about Isla initially, and about how perfect she was, obviously, and how it wasn't strange that I didn't want to wash that face cloth that I'd washed her with, and it wasn't morbid that I kept that even though it had her blood on it. And you validated that to me, that no, that's perfectly normal, that's your child, and that's evidence that she existed, and that she was real. But then the initial reason that we had contacted Sans Lothians was because everything had flipped on its head so much, only because we'd actually listened to other people's experiences. He wanted to ask about the funeral, because initially we'd very much planned on just having a service at the graveside, and it just being very, very small. And while we still wanted it very small, you had suggested that we should have something before that, because it's a horrific day, and the graveside bit can be the most horrific bit anyway, but to have some bit that would celebrate her life, and possibly even have a positive memory of, which is bizarre, but it's true. So we discussed with the funeral director about having a place, going somewhere. I didn't like the idea, because we still did want it small, and just our closest people, because I was still not ready to deal with other people's grief, and I still felt guilty, and I still do to this day, but still was really, really battling with guilt at that point. And I just wanted our people, didn't want anybody more extended family than that. And I sort of struggled with the idea of having it in a church because of that, because I didn't want an empty church. And so we'd spoken to the funeral director, who, it was a very small family funeral director that's very much sort of almost out of his house. It's not in his house, but it's attached to his home. But Colin grew up with his sons, and it was somebody close to the family that had her, and that really meant quite a lot, that she wasn't just a baby, she was Colin's baby to him. but because it was such a small funeral director, they didn't have like a chapel of rest or anywhere that we could do something. So he'd contacted Morton Hall to see what Craigmillar Castle Park had when they were up there, because there's a little building, but he didn't know what was in the building. But it's just really toilets and a corridor, there's not much. So they'd said, no, it's not really the sort of place you'd want to have any sort of service. So he suggested that we had it at home. And again, that had been initially because we're not comfortable with death in our society, and the thought of having a coffin and a service in your home, it's just, some people are, a lot, including myself, that seems quite alien. But the more and more we discussed it, the more and more it sounded right, and the more and more it felt right. And then on the day, it just totally felt absolutely right. And they brought her to the house, and we had flowers everywhere, daffodils all over the windowsill. And we've got big, deep windowsills, and I remember the light coming in, similar to, yeah, and the light came in and came right through the daffodils, and she was a yellow baby anyway. And because we hadn't known, everything was yellow, we hadn't known if she was a girl or a boy. So most of the stuff we had was yellow. And then she arrived with the funeral director, and he brought her in her little white coffin. And then we almost realised how loved she was, because the flowers just kept coming. And she was surrounded by all these flowers. And then around the flowers were all her people. And she was literally surrounded by a circle of love. And Sandy from the hospital came to the house, and he led the service. And I read a little poem, the Little Snowdrop poem, which a lot of people will know. And then we went to the cemetery, and whereas in the house there was so much love, and I still felt that at the cemetery, but I could hold it together in the house. And at the cemetery I felt like I was about to break, but I managed to keep it together, but like so fake. Just, such a mask, to the point that I remember joking, and it was because I couldn't handle anybody else's grief, and everybody else was so torn up. And I remember, I was like, you must all think I'm a weirdo, but after she'd been buried, and, the boys had all lowered her down, and everything was sort of done, and everyone was milling around, like, really, really, really upset. And I remember joking and saying, right, gin and tonic. And I mean, so detached, like ridiculously detached. It sounds so callous, like it was my baby. But I couldn't cope. I didn't even have a gin and tonic. I had a cup of tea when I went home, because I probably would have been sick if I'd had any alcohol. But we went back to the house, and I'd made all this stuff, and I just, because that was something I could do, something I could do for her was get this funeral right. And because I was never going to be able to do birthdays and all of these things, so I could at least get that day right. And none of us had worn black. We all wore bright colours, and I had this flowery dress with loads of big yellow flowers on it and purple flowers, and it was almost, if people had seen us, apart from the coffin, but if people had all seen us leaving the house, they would have thought it was a christening. It was that sort, and it had that feeling. It was really bizarre, but that was almost the feeling that it had when we were in the house. At the graveside, it was slightly different and a lot more heartbreaking. But in the house, it was just love. That's all it was. It was just so much love poured towards her and into this one little girl. And yeah, it was very, I was glad that I could do that for her. I was really glad that I could give her that day, and we could all just be there for her and recognise her. And it was still small. Obviously, my mum and Colin's mum and my sister, Colin's brother, my best friend and his best friend, and then his dad and his granddad, and our midwives came. They were incredibly supportive. They really, like, out of this world supportive. I was very, very lucky with the two of them. They kept visiting for as long as I needed, and one of them had written a poem about snowdrops, so she dropped that into us, and just very validating of her life and explaining that her life has touched them, and that as long as they continue on in their careers and their lives, that she will have affected them and therefore will affect so many other babies, because it's that ripple effect. And I've spoken about it before so many times, but I so believe it, that our babies touch our lives, and then they touch other people's lives, and they touch other people's lives through us and through that person, and it just keeps going. And I really, really strongly believe that. I know that she's had such a profound effect on me. I'm a totally different person. I'm still Steph, but I'm a very, very different Steph. She made me a mummy, and she gave me so much strength that I didn't have before, and so much love that I'd never felt a love like that before, ever. I'm very loved. I have an amazing family, an amazing partner, and amazing friends, but that love, that's something else. And she gave me that, and I'll always be so proud of her for it. After contacting St. Lothians about the funeral, we didn't actually have much contact with you guys after that for a wee while, and we then it was quite a few months later that we contacted again, just because we were struggling a little bit, really. But we'd always been made to feel that no matter what, the doors were open, that we could just, you would be there when you were needed. And when things got a little bit much, we contacted St. Lothians again, and came in to meet Nicola and have a chat. And that's the thing that's really worked for us, is that I didn't feel that, I've been to a couple of support groups, and a member of the Facebook groups, but I didn't feel that I needed, we dealt with things really, really well together, and we really supported each other, and that was how we got through it. And everybody's different, and that's what's really amazing about St. Lothians, is that we didn't need to come to all the support groups, we didn't need to access counselling, but it didn't mean that they weren't there for us. We could pop in and out, and we know that they're there for us at any point that we need. If we struggle a wee bit on our journey, if we hit a wall, if something new happens and comes up and hits us in the face, as it's liable to do and has done a few times, I know I can pick up that phone, and I don't have to explain my story again. They know who I am, they know Isla, they know what we've been through, and I can just go, I'm really, really struggling with this, get a little bit of advice, get a little bit of support, and then almost pull back again, and go back into how we cope on a daily basis, because they're so person-centred, and it's all about the individual family and their needs, and the individual person and their needs, and the individual baby and how they affected that family and that person. And I know that Isla will always be recognised in that way by SANS, but I don't still have, it doesn't mean I have to go into a support group every month. And then throughout our subsequent pregnancy of my son, I had to bleed at the very, very start of the pregnancy. And I remember phoning in an absolute panic, just going, no one else is going to understand why this is absolutely destroying me quite as much as it is, and why I can't just wait and see, and I can't cope with this. I felt like I was going to break down. But no, I thought, no, Sans will get it. And when my son became ill after he was born, and we ended up in the sick kids, and he was in ICU, Sans will get it. And it's that I know that they're there whenever I need them, but it doesn't mean that I have to be involved constantly. And I think that's really, really important. I think that's really valuable, because not everybody can physically go to a support group every month, and not everybody mentally can cope with that. I can't. I can't take on everybody else's grief all the time, because I get too bogged down and worried about other people. And it really upsets me. I get really, really worried about other people, and I can't cope with that. It's not good for my own mental health. But if I'm struggling, I know I can go to one and I can vent, and then I can pull back again. And I know that the women there aren't going to judge me for pulling back. And I know that nobody who works for SANS is going to judge me for pulling back. They're just there when I need them.